Okay, and our moderator tonight is Judy Fan, so I will start things off by just introducing Judy. Judy did her PhD at Princeton, and after a postdoc at Stanford, she joined the psychology department at UC San Diego, where she's an assistant professor, on her way back to Stanford, as I understand it, next year. And please welcome Judy, who will moderate tonight's session. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Thomas. Really excited to be here. Thank you all for joining us for our third Keynote and Fireside chat of the conference. So I will begin by introducing our three invited speakers. So first we have Professor Malcolm MacIver, Professor of Biomedical Engineering, Mechanical Engineering, and Neurobiology at Northwestern University. His research group is interested in understanding how animals acquire sensory information and use that to guide movement, decision-making, focusing on interactions between biomechanics, neural computation, and evolution. He then incorporates these principles into advanced biorobotic systems and large-scale simulations. And for this work, he's received the 2009 Presidential Early Career Award for Science and Engineering. MacIver's also developed interactive science-inspired art installations and consults for science fiction, film, and TV. Our second speaker is Professor Moira Dillon, currently assistant professor of psychology at New York University. Her research group uses cognitive, developmental, and computational approaches to gain insight into the origins of human cognition, especially how infants and children's precocious knowledge about objects and places is derived from evolutionary processes, and how that knowledge forms the basis for abstract thought. She is the recipient of an Early Career Contribution Award from the American Psychological Association, Rising Star Award from the Association for Psychological Science. Her work is supported by the NSF, DARPA, and the Jacobs Foundation. And our third speaker is Professor Deepak Pathak, assistant professor in computer science at Carnegie Mellon University. His research group investigates artificial intelligence at the intersection of computer vision, machine learning, and robotics, with the ultimate goal of building agents with a human-like ability to generalize in real and diverse environments. His work has been recognized with a stunning number of Best Paper Awards, as well as faculty research awards from Samsung, Sony, Google, and Good AI. So please join me in welcoming our three wonderful invited speakers to CCN. I'm just going to say a little bit about how this session is going to be organized. First, we'll hear 20-minute talks from each speaker, beginning with Malcolm's, then proceeding to Molly's, and closing with Deepak's remarks. After these talks, we'll then transition to a panel discussion where we'll have an opportunity to hear these three perspectives in conversation with one another. I'll start the discussion off with a couple of questions, but then close by inviting you all to pose your own questions. In the meantime, please save all of your questions for the discussion period at the end of the session. And if you do choose to ask a question, please do your best to pose one that's pertinent to all three speakers. If you have any questions for a specific speaker, I suggest coming forward at the end of this KNF to introduce yourself to that speaker. Okay, so our first speaker is Malcolm MacIver.
Well, thank you very much, Judy, for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I had an amazing day today with the incredible quality of the talk, so it's a high bar to try to meet. I'll do my best. So I'm anchoring, we're all going to be talking about all the timescales, but I'm going to anchor the evolutionary timescale, I guess. And in honor of that, I thought I'd show you this, one of my favorite images of fossils. This is a fossil of Claudina, an organism that lived 550 million years ago. Its importance in evolutionary history is that they contain the first evidence of the innovation of carnivory. And this innovation is thought by most paleobiologists to underlie the arms race between sensors and effectors, between predator and prey that eventuated in the complex nervous systems that we all are. So what's happened since then, 550 million years ago? Well, one of the things is we've gotten bigger. These are animals on the size scale of millimeters, and that was pretty typical of that time. So animals got really big. They developed these massive sensory systems, large eyes, various other kinds. And I'm going to focus on vision because in analyses of predator-prey interactions, both underwater and on land, the most active predators typically use vision. So that's one of my excuses, at least. There are some others. I want to start by telling you some properties of vision in water and on land to anchor some discussion of the task structure of those two kinds of environments and predator-prey interactions. So this is the horizontal visual range when viewing a 30-centimeter black disk based on a bunch of simulations and empirical data collected in these two papers. And this is for a 10-millimeter eye, which is typical of the ancestral fish. And so what you see is through coastal water models, the right turbidity for on the order of kilometers within a continent. A typical animal with a 10-millimeter eye can sense a 30-centimeter black disk about 7.2 meters away. Now, as you triple the eye size, look how small the margin of increase is. It's very little. And eyes are metabolically costly tissues, so this might not be a very worthwhile investment. On the other hand, if you look at air, you get almost an order of 100 increase in range, therefore about 1 million increase in volume, depending on how well you swivel your your visual system. And increasing the eye size really drastically increases your range in air. Now, this got me excited when I came across that fact pattern to look back at the fossil record and try to find papers by paleobiologists examining how the release of constraint from water to land might have led to an increase in orbit size. And as hard as I tried to find these papers, they did not exist. Even all the fossils were there, all the taxa were documented. I talked to Neil Shubin, one of the discoverer of Tiktaalik, and he said, yeah, we've noted the increase, but we've never bothered to measure it or plot it. So I did an analysis with a proper paleontologist as to what was going on in that era. And we found that there was a tripling of eye size between ancestral fish and the first terrestrial organisms. And there's an intermediate group that were sort of half fish, half land animals, where you get a middle size eye. And interestingly, there's a group of terrestrial animals that reverted back to water, and their eye sizes decreased back to pretty close to the average for aquatic fish. So that was super exciting, and to me, one of my favorite discoveries of my scientific life. However, there was a big problem, which is my prediction was that the tripling would occur once we came up onto land, whereas in fact what happened was the tripling occurred 30 million years before we came up onto land. So that's a wee bit of a problem. So we looked carefully at what's going on with the skulls, and what's going on is quite interesting. Here's a typical Sarcopterygian, one of our ancestors, these lungfish-like animals. This is Tiktaalik. Now notice already a flattening of the skull with the eyes kind of perched above the skull table. And now, and this is still transitional, this animal, Parmastega, just a recent discovery. And look at how far the eyes are perched above the skull table there. And here is a modern alligator, all right? So we think what's going on is that these animals are already using aerial vision, and that's why their eye size is increased. And to hunt what? There are no vertebrates on land at this point, as far as we know. So they're hunting either other vertebrates that are coming up. There's a period of low oxygen, so they're coming up to breathe through these spiracles that are in green, and they're causing surface waves, so maybe they're hunting with that, or maybe there's enough invertebrates on land that preceded vertebrates to be hunting them on the beaches. Who knows? It's unclear as of yet. The eye sizes continue to increase. So let's apply this information we now have about how eyes changed in the water-land transition and how vision changed to better understand task structure of aquatic and terrestrial predator-prey interactions. So here's a typical underwater scene. Actually, not so typical, because usually you won't see an organism in a picture like this. But so a typical scene is essentially isotropic medium that has high contrast attenuation. And you see a very interesting thing, which is detailed in this paper. If you throw a dart at a calorie in this biome, in the aquatic biome at this time, just to randomly sample where those calories are, and you only consider the calories that a jawed animal would be interested in, our ancestors, and that means not microorganisms and not phytoplankton. Basically, 99.9% of what you hit has to be another animal. In contrast, and so let me then tell you a bit about how predator-prey interactions work in this case. You have, and these are work we've done in the past 15 years, measuring and modeling motor and sensory volumes of a variety of species of fish, both visual, electrosensory. Their sensory volumes typically are pretty small, as I showed you with the vision data. Their immediate motor volume, or small time reachable set, as they say in control engineering, is also quite small. We've documented this. And that's basically what we consider is what they can get to in the next sensory motor delay time, which is 100 milliseconds. So they're sweeping these volumes through space. They come up against a predator, say, and then they have these specialized circuits in the tectum, called the colliculus in us, and in the hindbrain that lets them escape very rapidly, all right? Now, what happens with land is, first of all, you notice this glorious long sight lines, this exuberance of vegetation, and now, in fact, if you throw a dart at a jawable calorie, 99.9% of those darts will fall on plant matter. So there's not a lot of predators in comparison to here, but every animal is a prey to some predator, and there's lots of those to go around. So I'm going to focus on the prey point of view a little bit here. The motor volume hasn't changed much. Our muscles don't change a whole lot, but our sensory volume has increased by a factor of 1,000,000. So it's perhaps in this gap between this hypertrophied sensory volume and the motor volume where things like planning might be able to fit, because there you get some time, right? We're really under harsh kinematic and dynamic constraints in this situation. And so I've detailed that argument here. And so you can imagine early animals sort of possibly looking out and seeing three possible trajectories. One goes near the predator, one makes a noisy splash through a pond, and one is relatively safe, and hopefully they will pick that one. So another way to think of this sequence is to think of things as a spectrum of behavioral control, where on one end we have cache responses, which are innate or previously learned sequences of actions released by a particular state configuration. And let me show you a video of that, of a recording that we took in our lab of a dragonfly nymph attacking a larval zebrafish. This is a 6 millimeter long animal, and it's slowed down by a factor of 8.3 so that you could see it, because otherwise it goes by too quickly. And so take a look what happens. All right, so that interaction takes 20 milliseconds from the time the labium comes out of the nymph to the time it comes back. That's a brief amount of time. In us, these circuits still exist in the colliculus and hindbrain, not Modner-mediated as they are in fish, but by other cells, which allow us to do feats like swerving to avoid a deer on a nighttime road in just the nick of time. Now, the other end of this highly simplified spectrum of responses is computed responses, also known as planned, perhaps, or model-based. And here we estimate the outcome of a sequence of actions, assess the utility of outcome, and select sequences with high expected utility. And so let's take a look at this. Leopard. Note the way it's using the occlusions in the space, and note the teeter-totter between the sensory volumes of the two animals. As the springbok lifts its head, the leopard goes down, and now the leopard is just like this is easy. I've got this tree, and now all I have to do is wait for my target to put its head down for another munch of grass, and I'm home free. Oh, come on, come on. There we go. All right, I'll end it there. So a hypothesis we could have here is that terrestriality provides long sight lines to distant targets in predator-prey interactions, calling for long action sequence driven by careful inspection of the environment and adversary. So a question might be, how does the environmental structure, e.g. a tree in front of the antelope, in interaction with the animals within it, affect where this is useful? And so we want to test this using simulation. And so here's our setup. It's a grid world. You've seen grid worlds already at this conference. We have a generative model to obtain random worlds of specified clutter density. We're going to quantify clutter density with entropy just for convenience. And the setup is essentially the prey is a planner, and the predator is a dumb reactive agent. It basically will pursue at 1.5 times the velocity of the prey whenever it sees the prey. And if it doesn't see the prey, it goes to the last point that it saw the prey, and if it hasn't seen the prey, it randomly searches. All right, so that's the setup, and it needs to get to safety to survive. Okay, so what do we use? We use a modified version of Silver and Vanessa's partially observable Monte Carlo planning algorithm, and I won't go into the details, but some of you will already know that it's basically a tree-based system with UCB1 and rollouts and a particle filter for belief state tracking. And so now we're going to look at how do these different environments over many repetitions, many repetitions of different worlds with our generative model, how does planning do as a function of the entropy of the environment? And so we're going to look at low entropy, low clutter, and high entropy, high clutter. And what we see here, survival rates on the y-axis, is that relative to a habit algorithm we've picked, which I won't go to the details of, it doesn't do that well, and either at the high end of entropy or at the low, but in the mid, we see some pretty interesting things. We see a pretty big jump in survival value. Now, this is interesting to me because I remember learning many years ago about the savanna hypothesis, which is an idea that hominins gained bipedality when they came down from the tree, split from chimps and associated primates 6.5 million years ago, and invaded these highly risky environments. This is actually based on archaeological evidence. They invaded these patchy environments. And you can't swing from tree to tree in these regions, right? So you got to do something else. But in any case, the Okavango Delta in Botswana is the closest analog considered by ecologists that study this to what hominins looked at 6.5 million years ago. And this is exactly mid-entropy. We've done the calculations on this. And here is a paper by Dart from 1925, which I really like. He's announcing the discovery of Australopithecus, a really important ancestor. And he says, in my opinion, Southern Africa, by providing a vast open country with occasional wooded belts and a relative scarcity of water, together with a fierce and bitter mammalian competition, furnished a laboratory such as was essential to this penultimate phase of human evolution. Well, it's no longer penultimate. There's been 5 other species since then, but nonetheless, it's I think, a testament to his keen insight here, and hopefully I can convince you there's actually some computational basis to this as well. So this was a hypothesis I already showed you. Now we're going to test using experiment. So we're going to have a robot, an autonomous robot, pursuing water-restricted rodents. I'm only going to talk about musculus, but we've also been working on grasshopper mice, which is a true carnivore and an amazing organism, and also Parameciscus and some other animals. So they're trying to reach a water reward, and we're going to want to compare these results to simulations. And a lot of this work, this is a very close collaboration with Dan Dombeck, who does amazing work in the hippocampus and is just a brilliant person, and it's an honor to work with him, and he knows his way around mammals. I have worked for 20 years on fish. I think mammals need heating pads or something like that, but he's really, he knows his way around. And I want to really point out the students involved too. Orjan Mugan, who's now postdoc in David Reddish's lab, did the first bit of work. Gabrielle Wink did the work on the robot, you'll see, and Alex and Herman, who are here in the conference, have contributed tremendously to all of this. And now we have Chris Angeloni, who is a postdoc working with neuropixel probes and dreads to get at some of the circuit mechanisms. So now we're going to expand our grid world to something we can build. So it's got more cells, it's got more complexity, 6 actions instead of 4 at every step. And we have the color code for this simulation I'm going to show you is the prey is green, predator is blue. It needs to get to this goal point. And these black squares are obstacles to both movement and vision. And the pink squares are the prey's belief that the predator may be there according to our particle filter, and darkness is proportional to certainty. And so you can see the prey moving around, the particles. The more diffuse the particles, the more uncertain the prey is as to where the predator is. It kind of dithers about and takes glimpses until it has enough information and then starts to move toward the goal. And so that's that. So here's the actual habitat designed to be exactly structurally the same. Here's the mouse, here's the robot. We have a white noise generator to block auditory cues, and the arena is cleaned with alcohol between mice to block olfactory cues. Here's the robot. It's taken more work than we expected. One of the things that we really had to work hard on was what would be aversive enough, because the first few generations of robots just weren't scary enough for our rodents. So this has got quite a bit of punch to it. It's something between a puff and a Will Smith slap at the Academy Awards. And so we have position in 360 degrees, non-occluded sensorium updated at 30 hertz. Okay, and here's what the animal does in response to that puff when it turns red. Okay, so puff occurs when a puff or capture occurs when the mouse is within 2.5 cells of the robot. So now survival rate is essentially analogous to like if you die if you got puffed, sort of one puff is a death. Now mice must traverse this habitat from start to end, of hopefully evading the predator. Here's the water feeder, both at the start and the end, and they get across. This is all automated, so we can do 2 episodes a minute with these mice and collect tons of data. They go back for another water reward, and they go through it. So I want to show you some data, very preliminary data that we've only collected this in the last 2-3 months. These are trajectories when the mouse has no line of sight to the randomly spawned robot over the whole trial. And we find these trajectories to be pretty stereotyped. And they're essentially thigmotactic, going along the walls. Here it's as good as you can do thigmotaxis, given that we have barriers here. And here are some non-thigmotactic trajectories, so that doesn't quite fit the pattern. With a robot in the space at 0 entropy, we get purely thigmotactic trajectories. And now trajectories with the robot being seen by the mouse at some point, here's what we see. Quite a bit more path diversity. So what's going on with that path diversity? Well, here's a video that hopefully gives us a clue. So notice when it comes into this zone, it does a peek of the robot there, a peek of the robot there, and then it does another peek, and then it says, okay, I'm going to go around. And I know this is a slow, hulking robot that's not going to get me. These animals learn quickly exactly the dynamics of the robot. It's really quite uncanny. And so we've developed a peak detector to sort of automatically determine when it's using an obstacle to peek at the robot. The peak algorithm needs to have the line of sight near an obstacle because the whole point is crypsis. And now here's a plot of that same space, now with the peaks there. And you can see the peaks are occurring around decision points, right? You can see some good branch points there. So we're still making sense of this and preparing a preprint that will hopefully be done soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that. So here's a bit more data. This is a % of episodes where the mouse stopped in 0 entropy and 2 different 0.5 entropy worlds, mid-entropy worlds. So, and this is a case where the animal sees the robot. And no robot to see, you see a higher percentage of stoppages, exploration presumably. And now here's number of peaks per episode, and we see between 1 and 1.5 peaks per episode in both of the 0.5 entropy worlds. And now here's a video we're very excited about. We just generated this like 2-3 days ago, where we have prescribed to our simulation engine the trajectories taken by both the mouse and the robot to recover an estimate of the belief state of the mouse. Of course, we don't know exactly what the belief state is, but this would be the best guess we can do. And so take a look at what's happening, for example, with that peak there to the diffuseness of the belief state. So let me replay that, because it goes by pretty quickly. But just note, like, very diffuse belief state, peak, collapse, near expansion again, collapse, and then go to the exit. So this is, to us, very potentially interesting. And it really makes me think back to this video. And, you know, these are sexier animals, no doubt, and they're predators. But, man, these mice are onto something. They're doing something, I think, functionally isomorphic to what this leopard is doing, really. So the summary here is the interplay of long sight lines with occlusions in savanna-like habitats may enable some land animals to plan during highly dynamic predator-prey interactions where the cost of bad samples is death, not a typical feature, for example, of many of the AI uses of planning. A key issue is how to curate your belief state through careful choice of movement and glimpses so that uncertainty is reduced in tandem with the need to act. So how does route complexity pre versus post-peaking differ? Is the medial PFC needed for belief state maintenance, as a talk we heard yesterday might suggest? These hidden latent variables are tracked by medial PFC somehow. So with that, I'll take any questions, and if you don't want to ask me questions, I invite you to scan this code to play a game where we expose you to mid, low, and high entropy worlds with various kinds of sensory envelopes to play with and see how your behavior changes as a function of the environment. So thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Malcolm. And I can testify to how fun that game is to play. I did play it in the run-up to this conference, and it's like pretty addictive. So our next speaker is Moira Dillon.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So artificial intelligence promises to take the flawed intelligence of humans out of machines. We seek to build tools that are better, faster, or stronger than we are. Still, there are reasons we might want to put human intelligence into AI. Human-like AI would be AI that not only better understands us, but that we could better understand. Moreover, as many of us have noted, we humans are the best knowers and learners of the natural world. Our knowledge and learning are flexible, allowing us not only to survive, but also thrive in any environment that nature throws at us. And yet today I would like to propose something even bolder. I think we should investigate and begin to implement putting the early intelligence of human infants into machines. If an aim of AI is to build the flexible, common sense thinker that human adults become, then machines might need to start like we adults do, from the core cognitive abilities of infants, whether achieved through learning-driven or engineered approaches. Every adult here in the room today, even those of us who strive to prolong our adolescence, was once an infant, and we owe our common sense understanding of the world to the powerful scope and limits of infant common sense. And yet such common sense is absent, sometimes comically, from current AI. The work I'll present today merges the cognitive and computational sciences and finds that infants have a lot to teach machines and will help them learn better. To begin, we'll have to characterize the scope and limits of infant intelligence. Just what do babies know about the world? And then we have to ask how this infant intelligence informs our adult common sense. So today, I'll tell you about some of my lab's work characterizing infant common sense. This common sense, I believe, forms the foundation of our uniquely human intelligence. It shapes our cultural achievements, and it gives rise to our abstract, formal systems of thought. I'll focus on 3 content areas: people, objects, and places. By characterizing both the scope and limits of infant domain-specific knowledge, we should see clear inspiration for building human-like AI that harnesses our evolutionary gifts of both a strong foundation and a flexibility to new situations. For each of these domains, I'll first ask what might be particularly impressive or advantageous about infant common sense. And after telling you about some findings from my lab, I'll gesture toward the question of how these infant findings inform us about adult human intelligence, cultural achievements, and the future of human-like AI. From birth, infants are fascinated by other people. They bring to this fascination a rich set of expectations about how these people will behave. Infants' judgments about people and their actions are based on infants' inferences about people's underlying intentions. This kind of reasoning impressively allows infants to predict people's actions in ways that are flexible to new situations. On the other hand, because machines tend to predict actions directly, their predictions often fail in new situations. This chasm between infant and machine intelligence about people was one motivating factor for putting infants and machines into direct dialogue for the first time over the question of understanding people's actions. We designed a suite of tasks called the Baby Intuitions Benchmark, or BIB, which challenges both infant and machines to reason about the underlying causes of observed agents' actions. Through 6 tasks, BIB focuses on agents' goal-directed actions, their rationally efficient actions towards goals, and understanding of instrumental actions, 3 principles of common sense psychology. BIB thereby addresses whether and how these principles might cohere in a concept of agents. BIB includes short, silent, animated videos with simple visuals, like those used in the seminal displays of Hyder and Simmel shown here, including basic shapes without eyes or limbs, undertaking basic movements in a grid world. This design allowed for procedural generation of BIB stimuli, and it emphasizes the high-level properties of agents, challenging the limits of observers' inferential capacities and reflecting the kind of abstract knowledge that infants are thought to possess. BIB's task structure adopts the violation of expectation looking time paradigm, often used to test infants, which includes a series of familiarization events that serve to set up an expectation, followed by test events, in either order for infants, an expected outcome that's perceptually dissimilar to the familiarization but is conceptually consistent, and an unexpected outcome that's perceptually similar to the familiarization but is conceptually surprising. If infants form the correct high-level expectation, they'll look longer at the unexpected versus expected outcome. So here's an example of BIB's goal-directed task. During familiarization, the clover moves consistently to the rouleau triangle across 8 familiarization trials, which differ slightly in the location of the 2 objects across trials. At test, the locations of the 2 objects switch. If an observer generally expects agents to have object-based goals, not location-based goals, then they should expect that the clover will continue to move to the rouleau triangle even if in its new location. An observer should find it unexpected, in contrast, for the agent to take a path that it took before, but this time to a new object. This task structure has been used in recent machine learning benchmarks focusing on common sense, and it's advantageous because it both protects against low-level heuristic-based solutions, and it allows for an algorithm's quantitative measure of surprise to be compared against a well-established psychological measure of surprise, infants' looking time. While infants are only presented with the videos of the familiarization and test events, models can train on BIB's background training videos, which include thousands of examples of BIB-like agents exhibiting simple behaviors in the grid world. Importantly, the test videos require models to generalize outside of the training distribution, combining multiple behaviors that exist in isolation or in a simplified form during training. Because the background training provides only expected outcomes, moreover, supervised learning on labeled videos isn't possible. So here's a very brief description of Bib's suite of tasks. We have 3 tasks focusing on expectations about agents' goal-directed actions. One asking whether these goals should be objects or locations, another asking whether goals should be shared across agents, and a third asking whether new goals should be formed when previous goals become unattainable. We have 2 tasks focusing on expectations about rationally efficient actions. One asking whether agents who have previously moved efficiently around obstacles to an object will continue to do so in new environments. And the other asking whether agents who have previously moved inefficiently around obstacles to an object will now move efficiently for the first time in new environments. Finally, we have 1 task on expectations about instrumental actions, asking whether agents should take only instrumental actions when they are necessary. We collected 336 11-month-old infant responses across our 6 tasks. So here's an example of an infant participating in the efficient agent task, which probes the expectations about agents' rationally efficient actions. Here the infant is watching one of the 8 familiarization trials. You can see the agent moves around the black obstacle in the grid environment to an object. Now, in the unexpected outcome, the environment has changed, but the agent takes the same path. It's perceptually similar to the path that was taken during familiarization, but now it's inefficient. The infant is surprised and looks a long time at this outcome. In the expected outcome, the agent takes a totally novel, perceptually dissimilar path compared with the paths it took during familiarization, but the path is still efficient. This baby isn't surprised and doesn't look a very long time. We also tested 3 learning-driven neural network models on the same trials that infants saw. These models span 2 classes, behavioral cloning and video modeling, and the behavioral cloning model includes both MLP and RNN architectural variants. What I'm showing here is the architecture of the video model. All 3 models' architectures are designed to form implicit mental state inferences from behavior. Prior to being tested, the models were trained on Bib's background training videos. At test, the models formed predictions about an agent's actions based on its actions during familiarization. To obtain a continuous measure of surprise as a correlate of infants' looking times, we calculated the model's prediction error for each frame of each outcome and considered the frame with the maximum error. While the performance of such learning-driven models has not previously been compared to human performance, let alone infant performance, and models like these are limited in their capacity for flexible generalization outside of the distribution that they were trained on, our comparison nevertheless tests whether the standard machine theory of mind captured in such models might be missing key principles of common sense psychology that infants possess. So how did infants and machines do on these tasks? What I'm showing here are infants' looking times in red and model surprisal scores in gray. The 3 tasks displayed here on the left are the ones in which infants demonstrated consistent action understanding about goal attribution and about rationality attribution, showing greater surprise, which is to say longer looking, to the unexpected versus expected outcomes. The goal attribution task shows that infants expect agents to have object-based goals. Infants are surprised, they look longer when agents move to a new object to test. The rationality attribution tasks show that infants expect agents to move efficiently to objects in new environments, regardless of whether they had previously moved efficiently or inefficiently. In 2 out of 3 of these tasks, the models show nearly orthogonal performance to infants. Models expect location-based goals, not object-based goals, or they have no relative expectation here. And models only attribute rationality to previously efficient agents who act in new environments. They do not extend the rationality attribution to previously inefficient agents in new environments. Finally, the 3 tasks on the right, where infants had no consistent predictions about the goals of new agents, about agents' goals when previous goals become unattainable, and about novel instrumental actions. For these, models showed no additional common sense psychology. I'd be happy to talk more about the results of these tasks, including what look like model successes but aren't, in the Q&A. Infants' performance on Bib suggests that their expectations about agents may be rooted in intuitive underlying principles of goal-directedness, rational efficiency, and causal efficacy. Yet the machines tested failed. For AI to look more human in its understanding of people, we would do well to learn from infants, whose concept of an agent is a rich constellation of attributes. AI can capture any one attribute, but the way they come together in human intelligence allows for the unique and surprising flexibility of human knowledge. As you might have noticed, Bib is not just about other people. There are a lot of objects in Bib. We've seen how infants' expectations about that agents will act on objects, not on locations, for example. I'll turn now from action on objects to communication about objects. Do infants also expect that agents will communicate about objects, not locations? What we'll see is that infants' expectations are similarly constrained to objects in ways that persist even in areas of human achievement, like language and art, that we intuitively think are the epitome of unconstrained free expression. For example, when infants hear a word that could be labeling either an object or a location, what do they think that word is labeling? Here's an infant participating in an ongoing study in my lab asking this very question. During familiarization, infants see 8 trials of an ambiguous figure being labeled by a made-up noun.
Look at the LORP. Are you looking at the LORP?
What expectation does this familiarization set up for infants? In one outcome, the ambiguous figure is disambiguated as a room, which is to say a place. If infants find this surprising, they'll look a long time, as does this 9-month-old infant here, a really long time actually. The figure is ambiguous because it could be either a place or an object. In fact, it's both. We created a room to be near identical. We created a room and a toy to be near identical and merged the images to make sure that this one composite was genuinely ambiguous. Will indulge me as an infant researcher and watch the whole thing. Maybe then, infants have a relatively stronger expectation that this ambiguous figure, when labeled, should be an object. In that case, they should look less at the outcome in which a person is moving the figure with their hands as an object. And indeed, that's what this infant does here and what infants do more generally. They expect the ambiguous figure when labeled to be an object and are surprised and look longer when it's a place. I should note that in a follow-up version of this study, infants hear tones, not language, during familiarization, and in this case, they don't look longer at the place outcome at test. But this must just be some helpful bias in language learning, right? We talk about objects way more than we talk about places, and there are so many different kinds of objects to learn about. To assume the referent of an agent's symbolic communication is an object seems like a good learning strategy. But what else could this bias possibly affect, possibly constrain? Well, I'd venture to say that this effect is surprisingly far-reaching. Not only does it perpetuate through development, but it also pervades other forms of symbolic communication, like uniquely human picture making. To see what I mean, we have to briefly step away from studies with infants to studies with children, who, as communicating agents themselves, can produce symbolic communication, whether in language or pictures. In one study, we had a group of 4-year-old children sit in a colorful room, and another group of 4-year-old children sit in front of a colorful toy, a toy model of the room. The children were asked to draw exactly what they saw. Here's what the room and toy looked like.
1 hour later.
All right, nice job. Guess what? You're all done.
When we looked at children's drawings, we found something pretty striking. Children left out the place information in their drawings of the room, but included the corresponding object part information in their drawings of the toy. While drawing may seem like the epitome of unconstrained expression, we see this object bias, this cognitive constraint, playing out in young children's symbolic communication just as it does in infants' word learning. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, infant findings inform us about adult human intelligence, cultural achievements, and the future of human-like AI. When it comes to this constraint upon our expressive freedom, seen in infants and children's object bias, I note that our use of pictures dates back at least as far as human prehistory, as can be seen in the spectacular drawings on the walls of Paleolithic caves. And yet, this art too privileges agents and objects with this same absence of places. Future art historians should attend to this cognitive story, and as AI seeks to replicate human art, as in the striking images produced by DALL-E 2, we might also need to keep these constraints in mind. To return one final time to Bib, I think what it teaches us about infants' knowledge about agents and objects is impressive. But as an infant researcher, what surprised me most about infants' performance on Bib is that it worked in the context of agents' navigation of these highly abstract spaces. places. The prior literature only suggested this constellation of expectations, especially agents' object-directed actions, in the context of reaching, not in the context of navigation. As we saw, infants expect agents to have goal objects, not goal locations. Nevertheless, infants' expectations of goal directedness and rationality depend on where an agent is. A new place has a particular geometry, and Bibb revealed that this geometry is indicative to infants of particular affordances available to an agent for forming goals and for acting rationally. Infants must be sensitive to the geometry of the environment to elicit such expectations. To conclude then, I'd like to bring the previous discussion of communication about objects into juxtaposition with whether and how infants can use the geometry of a place or its spatial layout with language to learn about kinds of places. In an ongoing study, we're showing 6-month-old infants, so infants who do not yet move around on their own, a series of 8 examples of one kind of place with a distinctive spatial layout, like an open field, during a familiarization phase. The examples are each labeled by a novel noun.
Look, a toma. There is the toma.
At test, we see if infants have learned this place category by measuring their looking time between another field example and an example of a different kind of place, like a closed canyon, which has a different geometry or spatial layout. In this case, if infants look longer to the novel type of place, we take this as evidence that they have learned the labeled type. And infants do just that, both with natural places like these and with artificial places, where we've controlled for texture and color, etc., allowing only spatial layout to vary across places. So while infants may have far-reaching object biases in learning about the world, this does not preclude their learning about places, even before they themselves can navigate. How could this be possible? Our evolutionary inheritance is indeed a gift of knowledge. Knowledge about people, objects, and places. For example, recent work in mouse neurophysiology has found neural responses in neonatal mice who have not yet opened their eyes, that reflected simulated navigation through the local environment. This is a hot topic here this year. This kind of experience or training may form the foundation of flexible knowledge about places present at the moment a mouse opens its eyes for the first time. Such cross-species neuroscientific studies give us hints about the neural development of our own high-level thought. Indeed, intelligence is an interdisciplinary site of investigation par excellence, from animal to human to machine. It would be a fascinating extension of Bibb, which has put infant and machine intelligence into dialogue for the first time, to now include other animals. Bibb called for an interanimating research program between developmental cognitive science and artificial intelligence. The work I've given a brief glimpse into today demonstrates that such a program is both possible and generative for both fields. Ultimately, you seek to know whether human knowledge can indeed be built, whether in human or machine, from the foundations our cognitive and developmental theories have postulated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly, for that wonderful talk. Our third and final speaker in this session is Deepak Pathak. And take it away whenever you're ready.
It's a bit daunting to follow up after videos of cute babies with ugly robots, but I'll try to show some cool videos with them. So hi, I'm Deepak Pathak, and I will talk about continual sensory motor learning. So in our group at CMU, we work on, our long-term goal is to build general purpose embodied intelligence. Now, what do I mean by that? Is building robots that can do thousands of tasks in thousands of environments, okay? But this goal is very, very far from the way things are today. It's kind of the opposite. In robotics, things not only one for one task, but one task in the same environment. And it's very difficult to generalize things from, let's say, playing Go to grasping. You have to retrain the whole system from scratch every time for every new environment, every new task. Now, this problem of generalization is not specific to robot learning. This is at the root of AI in general, and in particular, deep learning. So let me show you an example to illustrate this. Let's talk about supervised learning. Now, supervised learning is the simplest case we know of machine learning, right? Where we have achieved superhuman success. On ImageNet, these models can outperform humans and work really well. Let's see how well do they generalize beyond this data set. And I take ResNet 50. You may have heard of this model. And I apply it not too far to a video of a dog. What it does, it finds things like cobra snake, ray fish, flatworm. Now, if you really squint enough, you can see, okay, why it's a flatworm, but it's not really, right? And the performance drops drastically from this superhuman on test set to merely 20%, 25% on these videos. Now, I showed this slide in my last talk somewhere, and somebody says, ResNet 50 is 6-year-old. Now we have transformers, so everything is changed, vision is solved. So I went to internet, fast forward 6 years, downloaded VIT, and passed this image. What do you guess? It says it's a Band-Aid. Now, if you look really close enough or like far enough, you can see, okay, why it's a Band-Aid, but again, it's a big failure. So what is the underlying issue here? The underlying issue is as follows. In machine learning, from the very beginning, we have been assuming with this assumption, we have been going with this assumption that our data at training time and at test time will belong to same distribution. And in the real world, this assumption gets violated every single second. And this is where things start to fail. For instance, in chairs and ImageNet look like this, but chairs to an embodied agent look like this. From a different angle, they may be fallen, etc. And these models completely fail to generalize. Now, in robotics, the same problem exists, but unlike misclassifying a chair to a Band-Aid, every single failure in robotics can cost you thousands of dollars. So the same robot which performs parkour trick falls over its own head when its hand gets stuck in a corner, okay? So the real question is, how do we generalize beyond training to these ever-changing scenarios? We have already done very well on these data sets, but our main goal here is to go beyond these data sets to these continually changing scenarios. And my argument through this talk is that the only way we can do this if we allow our agents to adapt continuously. In order to generalize to changing things, you have to change yourself and go to the new scenarios. Now, this may sound very simple argument, but this goes against all the existing prevalent approach in machine learning, which is as follows. You train your models very big on a large data set, and you keep them frozen, and then you test them at test time to new scenarios. In some sense, to me, this is like saying freeze your brain after the age of 10, and don't update any neuron, no new knowledge can come into you. And this is like, no matter how genius you are by the age of 10, if you're not learning, you cannot survive in this ever-changing world. So this is why in nature, the learning is opposite. Like, we continually learn through our life, and things happen in an incremental manner. Now, why do we go in machine learning with the first paradigm, not the second one? The reason for that is supervision. Because if an agent is learning continuously, we do not have enough money to keep providing labels to the robots every time throughout their life. So how do humans go around this problem? Because rewards in the real world are also sparse, they are not available all the time. So how does this kid over here know what to do to like, is she intentionally playing with this plane toy in the hand to become pilot 20 years later? Is she backpropagating the gradients from 20 years in the future? Not quite. In fact, the story is exactly the opposite, that these babies are not even driven by these faraway goals. They are driven by what they find interesting, what they are curious about. This so-called the notion of intrinsic motivation. So how do we build in this intrinsic motivation in our machines? So I have been working in this area for a long time, and many other folks. So I'll convey the high-level idea as to how things work here at a very 10,000 feet level. So the idea is as follows. The agent acts in the environment and collects some data, okay? No goal, no supervision, no human guidance, all agent by itself. Data will be random, that's okay. From that data, you build a model. Now, this is a forward model that if I am here, if I do this, what will happen next? Using this model, you predict the consequences of your own action before you take the action. And then you match your prediction. Okay, what happened in the reality? Does it match your action? If it matches, you are happy. If it does not match, you get more curious about scenarios. So high prediction error leads to high curiosity. Now the magic happens after this. What do you do if you're curious about something? You go back and explore it more and more. And the more you explore, the more data you get. The more data you get, your model improves. Your model improves, error goes down. Error goes down, curiosity goes down. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling loop that the more you explore, the less curious you get. So agent has to find something else to be curious about. So we applied the same idea to this simple scenario like this game environment over here. We do not use any reward, no supervision whatsoever. So we hide this top score from the game, and we let this agent be curious and do things in the environment. So in the beginning of the training, not much happens. It's acting randomly, enjoying life, building model. But if you let it remain like this for a day, and you come next day, something like this happens. The agent discovers to play the game. Without any knowledge that it's a game or what is the goal of the game, no knowledge of such a thing, it has discovered these useful skills which allow it to just go and jump over pipes, pits, etc. And you can reason about this, because if the agent don't make progress, it will get bored of the area around it, so it has to go farther and farther to be curious. Why does it kill the enemies? Because if it does not kill the enemies, enemies might kill the agent, it can get bored, so it's like a chain and butterfly effect, chain reaction, which slowly leads to all this complexity. Now, this result is 4 or 5 years old, and we have practiced lots of environments into robots. But there is a big problem. This works very well in simulation, where you can take millions of samples, or in real world, where you have very simple environments, like 1 or 2 objects out there. So it works just fine there. But it does not scale to more complex environments. And we have found this with all other methods which came out after that, or even before. Like for instance, let's take this environment over here. It's a kitchen and a robotic arm over there. Now, if you ask this robotic arm to be curious, it does this. So it is looking at the image of this scene and applying torques to its motors. So it's a control problem from vision. Now, if you really notice what is really happening here, it moves 1 or 2 objects, but most of the time, the arm is looking at itself. So moving, playing arm at different locations, and that's what causes it to get stuck in this loop forever, because there is enough things to be curious about. So what people do in these environments in general, they cannot solve this with rewards, so they usually use human data. So humans teleoperate the arm to reach the goal and then solve this task. And we would like our exploration methods to really work in these scenarios. So what is the problem here? So there is a big problem, which is a mismatch, I would say, the way what Malcolm talked about planning and these methods, how they work. All these methods are retrospective. What do I mean by that? Let's go back. We have a world model. We have some current situation. We apply some action. We predict the future. Now, in order to know whether I am curious about this sample or not, I have to actually take these actions in the real world to compute the real future and then compute the error. So the agent has to stumble upon something at least once to figure out if it is curious about something or not, and then explore from there. And which is a big assumption. Like you are basically asking that the agent will figure out something interesting on its own, and from then onwards, I will exploit this curiosity rule. And this is not just this method. Like you can take any prior formulation. They all fall into this trap that they're all retrospective or hindsight in nature. What you really want is you want the agent to really seek out interesting states. There is not enough time in the real world to randomly try all the actions and explore everything interesting around you. So how do we go about this problem? So we propose a way here which is called planning to explore. The idea is very simple. You take the same world model that you are building. Now, instead of trying to take one action and then compute the error, in your imagination, inside your model, you can imagine a sequence of actions, because it's a model of the world. So you can imagine what will happen if I do this, do that, and you try to find a trajectory that leads to most interesting examples, okay? So inside your head, you're imagining, you're planning, what will happen if I do this, that. And at each time step, you have some notion of uncertainty as to how uncertain are you about that location, and you optimize for the action which maximize the uncertainty, not minimize, maximize uncertainty, okay? But how do you measure this uncertainty? One simple way to build a Bayesian model or a probabilistic model. But if you build a Bayesian model, it captures 2 kinds of variance or uncertainty. One is aleatoric and one is epistemic. And the sum of both will be captured by a Bayesian model. But if you do that, it works quite well. I mean, it works just fine. But if the environment contains noise, like this agent is navigating, now there is a television, it just gets stuck in changing channels of the television if there's a remote in the hand, right? So what you really want is you want to avoid this aleatoric, but capture the epistemic one, which is the noise due to your inability to model, and ignore the noise of the environment. So the way we measure it over here is a very simple approach. We build an ensemble of deterministic models, and you compute the disagreement between deterministic models. So these variance only captures the variance of the modeling, and the variance of the environment goes to 0 because they all lead to mean location. And yeah, so the main point here is that planning and exploration basically are two sides of the same coin. You plan to explore, and you explore to collect interesting data such that you can plan better in the future. So these are two things which go hand in hand. So same environment as before, same amount of time. If you apply this approach over here, it very quickly starts to do interesting thing. It does not waste time in the free space because planning tells you that there is no interesting thing over there, and it starts to move kettle, it starts to open cabinets and do interesting thing. Okay? So this is the agent exploring, and you want to use this exploration to achieve task at test time, and in order to do that, you just basically again use planning. So you planned to explore, now you use exploration for planning at test time. So again, the same thing. This is the environment, you showed this goal image, and ask the agent, can you achieve this goal image? And here the agent, without any supervision, no demonstration, either at training or testing, follows some series of actions to open this. And these are low-level control. This is happening at very high frequency, so it's not just high-level primitives. You can also apply this idea in real-world scenarios. So here, this robot is opening a faucet by just giving a goal image at test time without any supervision. But note that so far, there is one big missing part which I hid under the rug, is that all these agents are acting in the same environment. Like they are sure discovering new things by acting, like opening a cabinet and moving things, but it's the same environment. Do I have to relearn the same thing in every new environment? Like, do you relearn walking if you move from, I don't know, Bay Area to Pittsburgh? No, in the snow, you adapt very fast. We have this ability to adapt our existing skills to very fast into a new environment. So how do we build such an adaptation in the same pipeline? It's a similar idea. So here, let's consider only one task. The task now is just like walking. So you're walking, and you have to generalize from this simulation to lots of real-world environments, okay? So you want to generalize from this simulation to this real-world scenario. And here, I'll show results first, then the approach. Here, the robot is adapting continuously at test time, and it has never been trained in this scenario. Okay. So you can see that this robot, despite never being trained here, can adapt in real time to walk in this scenario. Here is one more example, a more difficult one. So robot was never even trained for stairs. We are deploying it on stairs directly at test time. One more example. These kind of terrains are even hard to simulate because this is deformable and the ground is changing and shifting. So how does this adaptation work in these environments? So let's go over the idea very quickly. Let's say somehow you learned a skill. It may be using curiosity, some other approach, whatever. Then you vary your environment because you want to train your agent across multiple environments to generalize. It cannot work from only one environment. So you vary the environment, you vary like mass, friction, height, etc. In contrary to the common approach in deep learning, where we train invariant policies, what you do here is you train an adaptive policy over here. So you condition on the environmental conditions to obtain this embedding over here, which we call extrinsics. So you make the agent aware of the environment, and you train an adaptive policy and not a condition policy, not an invariant policy. Okay? But again, the problem with these things, people don't do this because this is not deployable. If you condition on it, this is not available at test time, so you cannot deploy this robot. So how do you figure out what is the environment like without relying on these actual parameters of the physics? Same idea as before. We want to estimate this ZT online, and here we'll use disagreement, the same metric from our history. But instead of disagreement of our prediction, here we compute the disagreement between what we commanded to the robot and what actually happened. So if you really think about this, if I'm moving my hand, for the same force, my hand will move 1 meter in the air. But if I'm inside water, my hand will move less for the same force. So there's a disagreement, and that I can attribute this encoding of the environment to the disagreement. So this is the key idea, and you can estimate this continually online because you have a new history every few seconds. And this allows us to really work on these diverse scenarios at test time. So we call this approach rapid photo adaptation, RMA. Let's analyze how good this adaptation is, or is it just a deep learning magic? Can we really nail it down? So here we have a difficult scenario inside the house. It was done during pandemic. We are throwing olive oil. Could have thrown canola oil, but a lot of money in academia. So here we have now plastic wrap on the foot of the robot and ask it to walk. It's difficult to appreciate how hard this task was. So let's go slow motion, like much more slower. So you can see it's almost autistic but can balance. And we can actually visualize these Z encoding, the extrinsic vector, and you can see it changes behavior as soon as the robot starts to go in the slippery terrain. Okay? So one more example, here we throw a weight on the robot. Again, it was never trained for this, it's very hard to see. Let's see in slow motion again. Look at how the robot bends to account for this. And this is completely emergent behavior from this real-time adaptation, because this was not trained for this. Okay? So this was blind locomotion, but we can also do the same thing with vision, because vision is required to perform more fine-grained scenarios. And here, there are results from vision, where the same robot is now operating from its front camera. No mapping, no decoupled vision and control, both done together from just a front egocentric camera. The same situation as before. This robot is adapting at test time to work on these very fine-grained scenarios, but now the adaptation is happening from vision. So we really drove around Pittsburgh to really find these difficult scenarios. And this walking is not like humans climbing stairs, because these stairs are the same size as the robot. So it's more like humans climbing hurdles, if there's an analogy. Now, one quick point I'll make here, that this adaptation has to happen continuously. If you only adapt once, this is continuous adaptation. But if you only adapt once in the beginning and not continuously, the robot falls after some time, because you have to really adapt to new shape and position of the robot. Okay? So this was curiosity and adaptation. But how do I go towards my initial goal, like to build machines like humans, lots of tasks and lots of environment? And I claim that, we'll start with like babies and learn using curiosity and adapt your skills. But I missed a very big portion of this, which Malcolm and Molly pointed out. Where is the knowledge from evolution? Where is this phylogenetical prior knowledge? This is not present. Now, the tricky thing is, I don't have billions of years to run these robots for. So it's not really, as a computer scientist, I don't really care about prior knowledge. I can just learn the whole thing end to end, but I don't have time, okay? So what we do here right now these days is we are trying to use internet data as proxy for prior knowledge. So robot cannot collect its own data, but how about data of other humans? So here we just go to YouTube. Our robot watches lots and lots of YouTube videos and learns a general prior as to how the world should be. Like if I have a laptop, I shouldn't be beating down the laptop on the table. I should be doing something with the keys, etc. General priors about this, okay? This is not same as imitation learning, just to clarify, which is like this, where the humans control the robot. This is more like learning by watching, which is a more natural paradigm for humans as well. And this allows to learn even when others are not teaching you. Like you can see babies carrying phone around and saying hello, even though it's not a phone, it's a shoe or something. Right? So it's the same kind of situation. You can learn about things even when they're not teaching you. So this is an initial direction in our group, but we have applied it to some scenarios. So here is what we do here, is we watch YouTube videos, then we take a single video of human in the environment and we find priors. Okay, so prior knowledge, priors, and then we employ same curiosity around these priors, and we learn the task directly in the real world. So here is an example. A human comes and opens the drawer, and then the robot practices around that prior for 1 or 2 hours. In the beginning, it fails to open the drawer because it's a different morphology, different force. Videos have no force information, so you have to figure out the force, etc. After 1 or 2 hours, it learns to open the drawer reliably, purely through exploration. And this approach trains in the real world in a matter of 1 to 2 hours, does not require simulation, does not require like spending 5 years, etc. And does not require a fleet of robot. Very quickly in the real world, you can learn for this task. So this is because of this, we were able to scale this to lots of tasks in lots of environments. So here, the same robot performing 20 different tasks in 20 different scenarios. This was done in 3 days before the deadline. So it's very fast and efficient method. So just to summarize what we talked about today, so I proposed a holistic view of how can we perhaps approach continual sensorimotor learning. Here, I talked about priors, which I believe we can take from YouTube data, like because there is lot and lot of videos. There are lots of daily life videos on the internet. You can find any kind of data, but perhaps not babies' data. So it's mostly adults doing things, but that's okay for now. And then we proposed a way to define this curiosity, which can start from any kind of prior, whether visual or motor, but use curiosity to increase your knowledge about the scenario. And finally, when you have learned things, how do you generalize them across scenarios through adaptation? All of these works were done in collaboration with my students and other folks at Berkeley and CMU. With that, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Deepak, for the fascinating talk. Okay, we're going to transition now into the discussion period. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions and then turn the mic over to you all to pose your own big picture questions. Okay, so to start out, and there are mics nearby. There should be enough. So each of the talks that you three just gave provided a perspective on relevant aspects of the world that might be worth learning about. So first, for Malcolm, when to plan in order to survive or to eat. From Molly, the questions of ontology, objects, like what kinds of entities there are in the world, objects, places, and people. And from Deepak, the kind of an amount of variability that you expect to encounter throughout your lifetime. And stepping back now, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about what computational principles or mechanisms you think might be unifying across these different domains and timescales, and what you might expect to vary across different environmental or ecological contexts.
I'd be happy to start. The slide you showed of the robot going over, was it chairs or something? Yes. Yeah. So you said something like, in this case with vision robot going over, was it chairs or something? Yes. Yeah. So you said something like, in this case with vision, you need a less accurate model of the world? Is something like that, or?
So it is also using an adaptation. So that was also using adaptation, but the previous results were blind, but this was using vision to adapt. And
so what impact does that have on?
Yeah, so if you don't have vision, you cannot do this task, because this requires precise locomotion. But with vision, there are more challenges in the sense that vision requires continuous adaptation as a necessity. While in the previous case, it may be optional in some scenarios because physics won't change immediately, but vision will change continuously. Yeah. So you have to take into account all those settings. And
So the reason I ask is that there's this, neurobiologists, comparative neurobiologists have for decades been trying to figure out, so is there anything interesting in terms of principles of, say, mammalian brains other than, give me the mass of the body, I can tell you exactly the mass of the brain. And the answer has been largely no, with one exception, which is Barb Finley discovered this pattern where if you look at isocortical components of the brain versus limbic components, there's this inverse correlation. And so the 9-banded armadillo, to my shock, and I have a slide I can show people later, but it's got this ginormous hippocampus, and the primate hippocampus is microscopic in comparison. And to me, what it represents is something like what you just talked about, which is if you've got vision and you can slave your state updates and model refinements off of the real-time changes in the world, what do you need a rich internal model for? What do you need a rich cognitive map for, right? And rodents, they're largely olfactory and low-light creatures, so yeah, they have pretty decent cognitive maps. A good thing that we discovered cognitive maps in them. But, possibly if we'd started with primates, it wouldn't have been so obvious. And so I think this might be one computational principle, is that in sensory ecologies that are favorable to, say, high frequency, volatile dynamic changes, vision is very favorable. And if you've got a situation like on land, there's 100 times more calories than in water because of the biomass distribution, but 99.9% of those calories are locked up in plants, which tend not to escape when you attack them. And so why don't you have a good map to figure out where those food packets are distributed rather than doing what a primate has to do, which is, okay, here's this dynamic scene, and now I've got to really get to work with my neocortex. So it's just a thought.
So the two timescales of learning that I like to think about is the individual human, right? So we have, from infancy all the way through adulthood. And I think what's most remarkable about infancy and what infants know is that it seems to strike this perfect balance of abstractness and also content, right? So there is knowledge about people, objects, and places like what I described, but it's abstract in such a way that it can recognize agents as these clover shapes moving in a grid world, right? And it can make inferences that are fairly rich about underlying intentions for this simple shape. So this is advantageous because it seems to support an infant's growth and development with rich common sense reasoning in whatever environment an infant might grow up, right? So we humans from human history have developed in diversities of environments, right? And this kind of foundational knowledge seems to be flexible enough to promote that kind of growth and development and create a really intelligent species. The other timescale that I like to think about is human history, insofar as I talked a lot about biases in infants' knowledge, right? This object bias, and I showed, hey, this is even present in Paleolithic art, we think, right? Or I think. Maybe I haven't convinced our historians or anthropologists of that yet, but at least I think there are some connections between the foundational knowledge of infants and the way we as a species have developed in the cultural productions that we have made throughout history. But you might say, okay, well, how do we overcome these kinds of constraints? And humans are incredible insofar as they develop technological innovations that can be passed down through generations. We have language, we have symbolic communication. Maybe it's the case that intuitively we're not going to be drawing landscapes, right, 35,000 years ago, but throughout human history we've developed tools and technologies to overcome this cognitive bias, this cognitive constraint, and now you can take one art class and you can learn how to draw a landscape, and you can overcome whatever difficulties you might have had intuitively in depicting the large-scale layout and be able to accurately do so. So I think we can I'm sort of impressed by how well infants are able to use the kind of limited and abstract knowledge they have to develop into really smart adults. And that's a timescale that I think is a really interesting thing to look at. And then also we have human history where we recognize these constraints or these intuitions that are present or absent in infancy, but we see that we as a species, through our technological innovations, through our use of language and pictures, we can transmit knowledge in a way that allows us to flexibly overcome some of these limitations and give us free expression.
So I don't really have a good answer, but I have a very good question. And the question is, like, whenever we talk about maps, for instance, or any such concepts, what time scale are we talking about? So there is one way of evolutionary time scale versus ontogeny. Other is like time scale of the organism, as in, is my map useful for going from my chair to cafeteria, or is it about moving my hand to the door and open the door? And the second one, which I'm calling sensory motor common sense, this has a much bigger search space. So for instance, I gave a talk at Berkeley just a couple of days ago, and then I did some calculation. If you open a door, you have 30 muscles in your hand. It takes 3 seconds to open. And the search space over there is 10 to the power 75. Put in perspective, this is the same as number of atoms in all of observable universe. So you are searching in such a big space. Now, do you make the whole map of the whole space, or this is completely ingrained as a synergy at this lowest level? So the example I was showing of the walking on the chairs, there was no map there. Like in robotics, the traditional approach is that you build a map and then you build control over that map. Now that may be a fine approach for going to cafeteria, but this approach is inherently causes many problems if you apply it to this door opening or walking on chairs, which is happening at much higher frequency. So, over there, we took inspiration from work of Professor Karen Adolph at NYU, where she shows that vision and control are tightly coupled and learn together. So the babies who learn to have fear of height by crawling completely forget that fear when they go to walking, because the vision system did not transfer. So here we did the same principle and put it all together and did not build any explicit map. But not saying the map is not useful. The map is useful when you go to cafeteria, because how do I go to cafeteria? It will be too random if I do that. So my proposal or question is that we should always also be thinking about this other time scale, or which is the action time scale. Is it happening at 25 hertz, 100 hertz, 500 hertz, or it's happening at 0.001 hertz? And this is where the answers drastically vary.
There's another interpretation of some of Karen Adolph's findings, which is that it's true that the motor action is reflective of, say, forgetting how to transverse a particular kind of barrier. But there is potentially an underlying knowledge of solidity or gravity that is not translatable into the action. So there may be a disconnect between what the baby knows and how the baby acts that I think is inspiration for doing studies that kind of uncover, again, these underlying intentions that babies can recognize in other people's actions that are sort of invisible in their behavior, right? Because babies don't do so much, right? If you had YouTube videos of babies, they'd be sitting there just chilling, right? Because that's pretty much all they do. So I think one of the things that makes it really hard to figure out what's necessary to program into an intelligent machine is finding out what these foundational aspects are that are connected to vision, that are connected to planning, that are connected to motor, motor actions, where there might be disconnects and where the knowledge might be invisible in behavior that humans are exhibiting, especially from early on.
This is a very good point. I will just answer. So I was mentioning it from more of an opportunistic point of view, like from a more empirical point of view. Like, I can certainly put maps even for this fast, high-frequency control, but the problem with those maps are heavily noisy. Mm-hmm. So what I end up then doing is end up denoising the whole thing instead of focusing on these precise things. So despite you may have seen a lot of videos about robot walking around, that chair task is actually very hard, because if you even have a millimeter or a mic, whatever, a small noise, your leg will slip out of the scenario. And so instead of building map, you just directly rely on this direct information feeding. Because I find it very hard to think of maps or these principles as a very high frequency control. But if I reduce the frequency and talk about planning longer, then I totally on board with you. And it indeed, like locomotion took the longest time to emerge. So phylogeny scale, I think, yeah.
So I'm super excited you're advocating for the 0.001 hertz timescale. Hey, this is, I think a strength of robotics is that, as neuroscientists, we're pretty focused on the kilohertz timescale, that being the timescale of many neurons. But when you think about, for example, the passive walker robots, have you guys seen those videos of passive walkers that show that you can get most of the dynamics of walking on very smooth surfaces just out of the right disposition of masses and springs. And you think about what the body is doing with bones and so on, which, bones have 0.4 watts per kilogram energy footprint, brains 40 watts per kilogram of energy requirements. And so the fact that the body would throw the cheapest structural tissue to get the base default dynamics down is, to me, like inspirational. And so I want to cheer on the 0.001 hertz timescale.
All right, these are great insights and points. And I have another question, my second question, and then I'll open the floor up. So what is the largest challenge, as you see it, to making progress and understanding what are the drivers of learning across timescales, and how do you see the other perspectives represented on this stage being integral to making that progress?
So I think one of the biggest challenges for developmental cognitive scientists and those who are collaborating with folks doing related work, looking at the origins of intelligence, is figuring out how we can determine what infants know. So we have these behavioral measures, but we don't have many other approaches yet that work with infants that can tell us, say, what the origins of their own abstract thinking or intuitive thinking might be. So I think some of the exciting developments here are using neuroimaging techniques with infants that are starting to get at what the cognitive neuroscientific representations are that are underlying infants' knowledge. I think we can look at this to determine what their experience of the world might be like, but then also how the circuits, the neuropsychological, neurocognitive circuits might be prepared from very early in human development. I alluded to this mouse work, this neurophysiology work with mice, saying there seems to be some sort of preparation for neural circuits that have to do with recognizing places and moving through places. So I'm really curious in terms of how we might use infant neuroimaging techniques to figure out potentially how these circuits might be readied for infants' experience when they do interact with objects or places or people initially for the first time or early on in development. I think it's also really exciting the collaborations that developmental cognitive scientists are having with folks who are doing computational cognitive science, insofar as creating benchmarks, for example, like BIB, are allowing us to provide a more comprehensive explanation or description of what a particular domain of knowledge might be in infancy. So usually in studies with infants, there are 1 or 2 experiments looking at a small aspect of infant cognition. But in thinking about this broader picture of domains of knowledge and comprehensive tests that might allow us to define abstract principles, I think this is inspiration that will help us figure out more comprehensively what infant common sense looks like across a bunch of different domains. And ultimately, we may be able to have a dialogue with folks building computational models to make new predictions about what infants might know. It's really difficult to test infants. So with these new online, kind of being forced online has also made it a little bit easier for us to do kind of high throughput infant research. Typically, a sample of 300 in the lab is something that would take years and years to achieve. Not so much when infant studies can go online. But I think these kinds of collaborations as well will allow us to have a more direct dialogue between folks who are doing research with infants and folks who are doing computational work. I'll make one more quick point, which is that I've also seen a really exciting movements towards using things like human videos of humans or maybe headcam data from infants to train computational models. I think this is really exciting because it offers a particular perspective on the world that seems to be important for human intelligence. But I also think that it's challenging to do this because I would argue that there's already in infant headcam data, there's already this bias towards attending to or this experience with people and objects and places in a way that is directed by, say, knowledge that we might already have, right? Or experience that might be inevitable, right? So little babies can't move around much. They're looking up into sort of whatever fills their line of sight. Usually it's going to be faces, really, early in the beginning. So you're going to get in this headcam data already these kinds of biases. And when you talk about learnability from a model trained on those data, you're going to see something that's already informed by human intelligence.
One of the big challenges or grand challenges I feel there is in AI is that currently all of learning frameworks, take them from the beginning, like neural nets, perceptron in the 60s to now, SVMs, anything, everything relies on the fact that your data is IID. Now, what is IID? IID is identical and independently distributed, that your data is uniformly sampled from the distribution that you want to fit on. This is exactly opposite of the data that we see as humans. We see a continuous stream, and every frame is highly correlated with the previous frame. But if you take the IID assumption out of the learning, nothing works. So any kind of model that you see, they are all trained with this IID assumption, and we have no way of dealing with this IID or non-IID data that humans seem to deal with. So which suggests me that there is something bluntly wrong here, because this IID is very hard to get rid of. And yeah, this is I think the biggest grand challenge, and this is at the lowest level. So this is not at the level of again like how your data is coming in, what kind it is. It's not that level. It's that level of when you update your model. That is very, very different from the way perhaps we update our brain, because we are getting a continuous data. In models, we need shuffled data through IID assumption. This is, I believe, is the grand challenge.
From my perspective, I guess one of the things I've gotten fascinated in with the work that I've shown you is that sort of the importance of self-model, accuracy of self-model in planning, and how awareness and self-awareness, an index of self-awareness might be, I guess, pulled by the need for the accuracy of your self-model. So in as much as you put yourself forward in complicated situations where you need to predict the outcome, you might have more self-awareness, and it does seem like, solitary mammals like bears that don't have to put themselves out too much in terms of complex social arrangements have cannot do the mirror task, whereas other mammals like dolphins that do a lot of complicated social interactions and presumably have to forward predict themselves into the future do pass the mirror test, in as much as that could be an index of anything to do with self-awareness. So I think, it would be amazing and fascinating for the planning community to start to tackle this problem. And I think, to some extent there might be even a moral imperative here, because a lot of things like temporal discounting and so on that we sort of automatically sort of goes into the way we treat future generations and climate and so on and so forth. If we could raise the awareness threshold on that through understanding how our self-awareness comes about in more detail, that would be pretty interesting.
Thank you, all three of you, for all of your insightful comments and wonderful talks. So I'm actually, because we're nearly at time, I'm going to close the session now and give you all an opportunity to continue these discussions over the dinner break, okay? So after dinner, come back here for posters and drinks, so you can redeem your drink tickets. And then tomorrow, please note that there's a 10 a.m. start for the contributed talk session to facilitate any later night discussions you may have this evening. Okay, so thank you all so much for coming to this Keynote and Firesides chat. Let's thank our speakers again.